Moving into the prestigious gated community of Oakridge Estates was supposed to be a fresh start. The neighborhood was well-maintained, lined with pristine houses, and homed professionals, retirees, and families alike. I had chosen this particular area because it promised peace and quiet, a sanctuary from the high-pressure world of the courts. Little did I know that the real authority in this community wasn't the homeowners, but the HOA president, a man named Gregory Albright. Gregory was the epitome of an HOA tyrant, a former real estate agent who had taken early retirement. He ran the HOA like his personal kingdom. From the moment I moved in, I could tell he relished the little power his position granted him. He walked around the neighborhood in a cheap suit, clipboard in hand, stopping at homes and making notes like a low-budget detective. Every week, homeowners received new violation notices. Grass an inch too high, a trash bin placed outside too early, a car parked slightly off-center. It was endless. I had managed to avoid his scrutiny for the first few months, keeping my head down and my yard meticulously maintained. But one morning, I found a bright red notice taped to my front door. I unfolded it and read, "Notice of violation. Unapproved vegetation." I frowned, scanning the document. According to the HOA, my flower beds contained non-regulation flora, and I was being fined $500 for failing to adhere to the neighborhood aesthetic. My flower beds? They were filled with neatly trimmed rose bushes and hydrangeas. Nothing invasive, nothing overgrown. It made no sense. I had no intention of paying a ridiculous fine over flowers. So I decided to pay a visit to the HOA office. I arrived at the small, overly decorated building near the community clubhouse, where Gregory sat behind a polished desk, his smug grin widening as he saw me enter. "Ah, Mr. Matthews," he said, folding his hands together. "I assume you're here to discuss your violation?" I nodded, keeping my voice calm. "Yes, I'd like to understand why my flower beds are being considered a violation." Gregory leaned back in his chair, looking far too pleased with himself. "You see, the HOA has strict guidelines regarding the types of plants that can be used in front yards. According to Section 14B of the handbook, only pre-approved species may be planted to maintain uniformity." I raised an eyebrow. "And who approves them?" He smirked. "That would be me." "Ah, so that's what this was about. Power." I took a deep breath. "Mr. Albright, I respect the HOA's desire for consistency, but my plants are well maintained, and there was no mention of them being an issue when I moved in." Gregory waved a dismissive hand. "That's irrelevant. The rules are rules, and failure to comply means additional fines." I gave him a small smile. "You sure about that?" He scoffed. "Of course. And if you don't pay, we will escalate it. The HOA has full authority over this neighborhood." I nodded, slipping my hands into my pockets. "Well, Greg, I have to let you in on a little secret." I leaned in slightly, my smile never fading. "I'm not just any homeowner. I happen to be a Supreme Court judge." Gregory's face paled instantly. Gregory Albright's smug expression flickered the moment the words left my mouth. His fingers, which had been confidently tapping against the desk, stilled. His lips parted slightly as if to form a response, but no words came out. It was as if he had short-circuited for a moment, unable to process what I had just said. "Why, you're what?" He finally managed, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier arrogance. I allowed myself a small, amused smile. "A Supreme Court judge," I repeated, leaning back slightly and folding my arms. "Perhaps you've heard of my rulings? I presided over several high-profile constitutional cases." I let that settle in before adding, "including cases involving overreaching homeowners associations." The color drained from Gregory's face. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear creeping into his eyes. Now, to be clear, I wasn't the kind of person to flaunt my title in everyday life. In my line of work, discretion was key. I had no interest in being treated differently or wielded my position like a weapon. But this situation? This was different. This was a petty tyrant abusing his power, issuing ridiculous fines, and intimidating homeowners simply because he could. Gregory cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure. "Well, that's interesting," he said, though his voice wavered. But that doesn't change the fact that you violated HOA regulations. I chuckled softly. Did I, though? I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on his desk with a satisfying thud. You see, Gregory, I took the liberty of reviewing the HOA's bylaws last night, and I found something quite fascinating. His eyes flickered to the folder as if it might burst into flames. What are you talking about? I opened the file and slid a document toward him. This is the original HOA agreement filed with the county registrar's office. Section 14B, the one you cited regarding pre-approved vegetation, was never included in the official governing documents. Gregory's mouth opened slightly, his face frozen in disbelief. That means, I continued, tapping the paper, you have been enforcing rules that do not legally exist. In fact, there is no official record of the HOA having any authority over specific plant species in homeowners' yards. You made that up, Greg. He blinked rapidly. That's not possible. Oh, but it is, I said, pulling out a second document. I also obtained meeting minutes from the past 5 years. In not one instance was Section 14B ever discussed or voted on. So unless you can provide documented evidence proving otherwise, this fine is not only invalid but an abuse of authority. Gregory shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier confidence now completely gone. Look, he said, forcing a strained smile, there must be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe we, need to update our records. I held up a hand. Oh, we'll be updating records, all right. But we're not stopping there. I pulled out another sheet and laid it in front of him. A cease and desist order, I announced. Effective immediately, you are to halt any and all attempts to fine homeowners based on fabricated regulations. If you or the HOA continue to issue unlawful fines, I will personally ensure that legal action is taken against you. Gregory sputtered. Illegal action? That seems extreme. I leaned forward, my expression turning serious. Gregory, you've been operating this HOA like a personal kingdom. You've harassed homeowners, issued baseless fines, and intimidated people into compliance. That ends today. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of a clock ticking on the wall. Gregory swallowed hard and sat back in his chair. He was trapped, and he knew it. I see, he muttered, rubbing his temple. Perhaps we can reconsider some of these policies. I smiled. Oh, you'll be doing more than reconsidering. You'll be publicly retracting every fine you've issued under those fake regulations. And then, Greg, you're going to resign as HOA president. His eyes widened. Resign? That's right, I said simply. Because if you don't, I'll be forced to bring up the matter with the state attorney general's office. And if they open an investigation, well, I shrugged, letting the unspoken consequences linger. Gregory's breathing had become shallow. He was beaten, and he knew it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled shakily and nodded. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. I'll step down. I smiled, standing up and collecting my papers. Good choice. As I turned to leave, I paused at the door. Oh, and Greg. He looked up warily. Consider this my final ruling, I said with a grin before stepping out into the bright afternoon sun. The aftermath. Word spread fast. Within a week, Gregory Albright officially resigned as HOA president. His departure was met with relief from nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood. People who had suffered under his petty reign were ecstatic to see him go. The HOA board, now under new leadership, wasted no time cleaning up the mess he had made. Every baseless fine he had issued was voided. Several homeowners who had been wrongfully charged were reimbursed. And most importantly, the HOA adopted a transparent and democratic process moving forward, one where actual homeowner input mattered. As for Gregory, well, without his position of power, he quickly faded into irrelevance. He spent the next few months sulking around the neighborhood, avoiding eye contact with the very people he once ruled over. Eventually, he put his house up for sale and moved away, probably to find another HOA where he could try to lord over people again. And me? I enjoyed every second of my garden. My roses and hydrangeas remained untouched, thriving as beautifully as ever. Every time I watered them, I couldn't help but chuckle, remembering the stunned look on Gregory's face when he realized just who he had been messing with. In the end, justice had been served. Gregory Albright may have resigned as HOA president, but I knew better than to think he would go quietly. Men like him, men who thrived on control, manipulation, and intimidation, never simply walked away. They lurked in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim their power. In the weeks following his resignation, I kept a close eye on him. The neighborhood felt lighter without his overbearing presence. Homeowners who had once feared his wrath now openly spoke about the ridiculous fines they had endured. The new HOA leadership quickly began rolling back Greg's fabricated rules, restoring fairness to the community. It was a much-needed breath of fresh air. But Greg, he seethed. Every time I saw him in the neighborhood, his posture was tense, his expression stormy. He no longer strutted around like he owned the place. Instead, he sulked, his movements stiff, as if the weight of his humiliation was dragging him down. I caught him glaring at my flower beds on more than one occasion. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might break a tooth. And then, just as I expected, he tried to retaliate. The retaliation attempt. One morning, I walked outside to find another red violation notice taped to my door. My eyes narrowed as I tore it down and scanned the contents. Notice of unresolved violation. Final warning. Failure to comply with community regulations regarding unauthorized landscaping will result in property liens and legal escalation. I laughed, not just because the notice was completely illegal, but because Greg was truly this desperate. He had no official authority over the HOA anymore, and yet here he was trying to flex non-existent power. It was pathetic. I grabbed my phone and called the new HOA president, a reasonable woman named Diane, who had already begun cleaning up Greg's mess. "Diane," I said, trying to suppress my amusement, "you'll never guess what I just found on my door." Within 20 minutes, Diane and a few other board members showed up at my house. I handed them the letter, and as they read it, their expressions morphed from confusion to sheer disbelief. "This isn't from us," Diane said, her brows furrowing. "I personally oversaw the removal of Greg's fabricated rules, and we haven't issued any fines since I took over." I smirked. "Well, unless you got another rogue board member, that only leaves one suspect." Diane looked furious. "He wouldn't." She stopped herself and let out a deep sigh. "No, he absolutely would." Greg had gone rogue. He had printed and distributed fake HOA violation notices, trying to intimidate me and possibly other homeowners into submission. It was time to shut him down for good. The legal strike. I wasn't just going to call Greg out in a meeting. Oh, no. He had escalated. So I was going to escalate higher. That very afternoon, I drove down to the county clerk's office and filed a formal cease and desist order against Gregory Albright. Since he was no longer HOA president, his attempt to issue fines under guise of HOA authority were legally considered fraud. But I didn't stop there. I also filed a civil suit against him for harassment, defamation, and fraud on behalf of myself and every homeowner who had received his fake notices. By the end of the day, Greg had been served with official legal papers. Greg's final meltdown. The next HOA meeting was glorious. Greg showed up, uninvited, of course, his face red, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. He tried to speak, but Diane cut him off. "Gregory," she said sharply, standing at the front of the clubhouse, "you are no longer an HOA official. You have no authority here. And yet, we have proof that you've been issuing fraudulent violation notices." The room filled with murmurs. Several homeowners, many of whom had been Greg's past victims, exchanged knowing glances, some even chuckling. Greg scoffed. "Oh, please. I was simply advising homeowners about necessary upkeep. It was a suggestion." I held up the fake violation notice he had left on my door. "Funny, this suggestion says I would face legal escalation if I didn't comply." I waved the official legal documents at him. "Unfortunately for you, Greg, you are the one facing legal escalation." His face turned from red to a sickly pale shade. What? "You've been served," I said, grinning. "Fraud, harassment, and defamation. Hope you got a good lawyer." The murmur in the room turned into outright laughter. Greg's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He stumbled back, his hands gripping his head, sweat beading on his forehead. This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You can't." "Oh, but we can," Diane cut in, her voice filled with satisfaction. "And I'd highly recommend you withdraw from the community entirely before we decide to press criminal charges as well." Greg's entire body slumped. His shoulders caved in. His lips trembled. He had lost. For years, he had ruled over the neighborhood like a tyrant, wielding HOA regulations like a weapon, trampling over homeowners who couldn't fight back. But today was justice. Greg didn't say another word. He turned around and stormed out the clubhouse, his head bowed low. It was the last time anyone in Oakridge Estates saw him. The final blow. Within a month, Greg sold his house and moved away. Some say he left town entirely. Others claim he tried to join another HOA, only to find himself blacklisted from every respectable one in the area. As for our lawsuit, Greg settled out of court because he knew he would lose. Every homeowner he had scammed got a payout. The new HOA flourished without him. No more ridiculous fines, no more intimidation. And my yard? My roses and hydrangeas thrived, untouched and unbothered. I would sit outside some evenings, sipping my coffee, admiring the peaceful, HOA-free serenity of my neighborhood. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, thanking me for finally ending Greg's reign of terror. And every once in a while, I'd hear a story about Greg's failed attempts to regain power elsewhere. But me? I had moved on, because in the end, the law had spoken, and Greg learned the hard way that you don't try to outrule a Supreme Court judge.